we can all pitch in and help. I think communities, well, because at the moment we haven't got a viable political vehicle, you know, I know people are trying hard to build one again, but we haven't really got a viable political, so we've got to build communities amongst ourselves to try and look after our people. And that's the way forward, I think, for the time being. That's where I would put my energies. So I'm going to hand over to Mike Newland. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, since we were last here, they've changed the lighting to what's called intimate, which means you can't read anything very easily. Yeah? Perhaps we should bring our own bulbs and walk in with our 100-watt bulbs and stick them in the socket. Well, when Chris asked me to do a talk on this, what I really wanted to talk about was what is the current political situation in the light of the last extraordinary 2 years. The trouble is I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that at the moment. It's not clear what's going on or what the political implications may be. Well, I know what's happened in the last 2 years. We all know what's happened. There was a coup d'etat. Interesting this, because Lawrence Fox, who is really just a media pundit, said on one of the more diverse media outlets that there had been a coup d'etat in this country and it had failed. 2 points there. Was there a coup d'etat and has it failed? There was certainly a coup d'etat. I mean, my goodness, this country, few countries have ever had freedoms taken away like that, like happened here. Has it happened anywhere? Even in China people are a bit freer. And it was all done overnight, and it was done by the use of the Public Health Act 1984. And some vague provisions in it to allow ministers small latitude in changing health regulations. On that basis, they turned Britain into a totalitarian state, fully backed by the Labour Party. And when Francis Hoare tried to take the matter through the courts really weren't interested. They just brushed it aside. Yep, that was the case that was brought by the millionaire in Monaco. Yeah. So if that's not a coup d'etat, the government, the opposition, the courts won't stand in the way. There was a coup d'etat here. Now, has it failed? Now, that's a more interesting question. Now, certainly the immediate controls on our lives have been removed, but that doesn't mean they will be for long. I mean, they've built a blueprint for a totalitarian state here. They've got it all ready. They've got the legal apparatus ready. I noticed that they're now not going to renew the emergency legislation, but it wasn't done, most of it, under the emergency legislation. It was done through the Public Health Act. As Lord Sumption has pointed out, they're not offering to repeal that or alter it. So the party's open to them to do the same thing again. I mean, they're terrifying. During the last 2 years, the level of acceptance of loss of freedom been quite terrifying. It's been a COVID theatre of virtue signal, moral superiority, and a lot of people who should have known better, who were happy to work at home and to go along with all this because they didn't have to pay fares. They had very comfortable lives with everything being delivered to them, and it was all done under the trope of the good of the community, as these sort of things always are. What nasty dictator ever did anything except for the good of the people? The left is generally, not just the Labour Party, the whole left that claimed to be against the Tories, the wicked Tories, never trust the Tories and so on, they all became backers of Boris Johnson, wasn't it? Yeah. The left was saying, let's have more controls. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And the whole phenomenon worldwide has thrown up these peculiar characters, like Jacinda Ardern. It's something very odd about her. When you look at when she smiles, she's got this sort of rictus smile. And I wondered about that. I thought there's something very odd about this woman. How did she get to be like this? Well, it turns out she grew up in a police family. It explains everything. What is the police mindset? The police mindset is go out and stop somebody doing something. The more things you stop people doing, the better the public will be and the better job you've done as a policeman. And like the Puritans, it's a nice day today, let's go out and stop somebody doing something. So I think that explains Jacinda Ardern. You've got some very odd characters running parts of Australia, very peculiar people like the man in Melbourne. Now, of course, because it's clear that there have been a lot of mistakes made, that's becoming clear during the last 2 years. The lockdowns didn't work, masks don't work, so how do they get around that? Well, there'll be a lot of what Kelvin Mackenzie called reverse ferreting going on. A reverse ferret is where public bodies or PR organisations suddenly change their position 180 degrees and gloss over the fact they've done it. They just slide over it as though nothing had happened. And Boris Johnson set the tone a couple of weeks ago by saying that we must be, regarding the virus, we must be humble in the face of nature. So that's why he's removed the controls, because we've got to be humble. But last year he was claiming to control nature. With his balanced and witty, they stood in a three and they were going to control nature. Now he's done a reverse ferret, exactly the opposite position. Nobody's pointed that out in the press. They just slide over the whole thing as though nothing had happened. So there'll be a lot of reverse ferreting going on. But then we move on to what are they going to do now? And the legislative programme that the government has is for a totalitarian state. Torture is now authorised. Torture and illegality by the state for security reasons is authorised. Controls on demonstrations, any excuse to close them down. All kinds of legislative things are going through, with some opposition from the Lords and odd MPs, who probably won't prevail much. They'll curtail it a little bit, go 2 steps forward, half a step back, or a quarter step back. So they're setting up the possibility, at least, of a future totalitarian state. So I'm not sure. Has the coup d'état failed? To what extent will their future measures be really effective in creating a totalitarian state? Because sometimes governments do things with the object of getting more power, but they don't work too well. For instance, for years and years we've been told they're going to close down anything political views on the right. So a lot of this can be hot air, legislative hot air that doesn't really work. But they've got a programme there. They've got the legislative programme, and then there's net zero. Now, net zero has a lot of resemblances to lockdown. You freeze in your home, you can't go anywhere because you can't afford it, yeah? And it's all for the good of the community, so you effectively become partially a prisoner. And meanwhile, net zero, it's impossible. It's not even necessary. We've got plenty of energy under our feet we can use. And that is being voiced a little bit in the press now. Why aren't we fracking? I mean, goodness, when we're pushed into the position we're pushed into now, with the difficulty of obtaining any reliable energy from other countries, Russia in particular, and anything else that might happen, they sold all this stuff about turbines and solar panels on the idea it was going to make Britain self-sufficient in energy. Well, it doesn't, because the big flaw with these things, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine when you want the energy, necessarily. So you've got to store the energy. Now, somebody used to be big in Greenpeace, who in Metro last week, who's rather backtracked on this. He said something very interesting I hadn't heard before. He said, how much energy, in the whole world energy storage capacity of the world, batteries and so on, how much energy can they actually store? And it's 1 minute of world use. 1 minute. That's all they can store. If you made it 100 times, it'd only be an hour and a half or something, like an hour and 40 minutes. So you're not going to be able to live off wind turbines and solar panels. It's completely impossible. So net zero is not going to happen. In fact, even after years and years of building these things, we're only producing about 6% of our energy from renewables, genuine renewables. It's minute. So it's never going to happen, but it's a splendid excuse for people to make money, and an even better excuse to turn us all into sort of prisoners, freezing in our homes, and still introducing gradually a totalitarian state. It may be hot air, there may be a change in mood, or politicians decide they can't get away with it. I mean, Boris Johnson would probably have had another lockdown at Christmas if his backbenchers hadn't revolted. Now, we're nationalists. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, rational nationalists, not talking about the ones who want to go around and march into other countries, but rational nationalists, what do we actually think? We think there are different peoples in the world, and peoples need their own little homelands. Everybody does, you know, it's not just us. Everybody should have a little homeland and run it in their own way. And compare that with globalisation. Well, Philip Bobbitt, in his book, The Shield of Achilles, difficult book, but it's well worth reading. The way he describes what's happened since globalization began, when communism collapsed, is this: that the state, before the collapse of communism, what we had was the national state, which was a sort of state which offered you protection against the world in your little corner. Yeah, the government protects you in return for a degree of loyalty to the government. And then the globalists came along, and what they said is, don't worry about the protections of your little local state anymore. They'll probably be abandoned. But the advantages of that will be replaced by even bigger advantages in what he calls the opportunity state, which globalization will provide. Well, we've had 30 years of this. Where's the opportunities? There were supposed to be vast economic opportunities, career opportunities, brought about by globalization. Well, they haven't arisen. It's certainly helped poorer countries of the world to develop, poorer parts of the world, but it hasn't provided any huge opportunity here. It's largely done away with sort of well-paid, reliable jobs and turned people into having to work on a part-time or regular 0 hours or no real career, no hope of buying a house. Globalization hasn't helped us. Another aspect of having little local states is that you have them run in different ways, and it's possible to compare which is better. One is better than the other, whether one is better than the other. If you have a global state and everyone's run the same way, there's no comparison possible. What's happened in the last 20 years is that something called wokery has gradually spread throughout the Western world. It may not be called wokery by only a small proportion of the population are devoted to religion, but the essence of wokery has spread everywhere, and the essence is this: that reality is not what you perceive or divine from looking at things, it's how you feel about something. If you feel bad about something, that something must be bad. Isn't that the essence of wokery? Yeah? It's all done it's Alice in Wonderland, where all judgments about everything are done on the basis of sort of rather flippant emotions of how you feel on the day. So one day something might be good, the next day it might be bad, because it's how you feel about it. That's why wokes are called snowflakes. They're not interested in rationally appraising what's good and what's bad in the world. Now, David Starkey pointed out that recently that Putin has observed all this going on, and he's realised something very, very important: that the woke Western world didn't think it was necessary anymore to think in terms of military defence or wars. Wars, darling, are so outdated, so last century. We don't need to think about wars anymore. We can just put them aside. Yeah, and, well, of course, Putin knows that's not true. War as the ultimate power, means of obtaining power, will always be there. But people in the West have forgotten that, because it's too uncomfortable to think of having another war. So we don't defend ourselves. And to say, if you don't plan for war, if you want peace, plan for war. Isn't that Tacitus, yeah? So Starkey is dumbstruck, really, by what's happened in this country and how people have lost track of reality, of how you actually defend your community and keep it going. I mean, it was a very embarrassing moment last week, I think, when the head of the German army admitted that they couldn't do much about Putin because they just didn't have the military resources to do it. They've now done a volte-face on that, and the Germans are now going to increase their defence capability. But we here, we've got hardly any army. What little could we do against Putin? Virtually nothing. Now, we nationalists have tried to deal with all this by saying that what's wrong is the wrong leadership. Yeah, which it is. Of course, we do have the wrong leadership. And that we can change the leaders, we can change the whole situation, which to some extent is true. And when we've campaigned about this sort of thing, we've been quite effective. For instance, there were some very interesting figures in Metro about the fringe or the alternative candidates in the recent mayoral election and how much they spent to get a vote. And very interesting figures. The mayor spent about, I think, 30 pence a vote. Count Binface spent 40 pence, yeah. He was way ahead of most of the others. David Rose, the Bitcoin salesman, he spent £13 to get a vote. £13.
Brian Rose.
And Lawrence Fox.
Brian
Rose. And Lawrence Fox spent £8 a vote. Now you compare that with our campaigning in the past, when we stood in the first mayoral election that was held, when Ken Livingstone was the candidate, I got 40,000 first preference votes, and we only spent about £7,000, something like that. So it worked out, allowing for inflation, about 30 pence a vote. So we actually got more votes for our buck than the mayor did. So I mean that's actually pretty effective campaigning, isn't it? I mean, Lawrence Fox is quite well known. He gets on the media all the time, and he had to pay £8 a vote to obtain a vote. Yeah. So we've done quite well in campaigning politically. We've sometimes done surprisingly well. We didn't win, but we've sometimes done surprisingly well. But what we've rather been blindsided to is the elephant in the room that we might have partly seen out of the corner of our eye. We weren't really sure whether it was an elephant, and that is the birth rate. Well, the current birth rate in this country is below replacement level. It's about 1.6. And among, of course, a lot of those births that are occurring now are among people who weren't born in this country. I dread to think what the actual birth rate is among our own core population. Probably about 1, when you need 2.1, something like 2.1 for replacement. And we really haven't drawn attention to this, and it's too much. It is discussed a bit, but another fact on that. Over 50% of women in this country now don't have their first child until they're over 30. It would be inconceivable to previous generations. I mean, when I left school, if you weren't pushing a pram within a few years, you were thought, rather letting the side down and, what's wrong? Can't you find somebody? You should get married. It's a normal thing to do. And we're now up to 30. Now, you can say this is partly to do with political changes, but it isn't entirely. Because for this reason, that when societies are very poor, they have to have children because they need the children to look after them when they're old, and they also need the children to work. Often in earlier times from the age of perhaps 6 or 7. But as societies have got richer, education, which has brought about greater wealth, has given people a greater range of opportunities, and so inevitably. People, women and men, see other opportunities, and they're not so keen on sitting in the cottage and having an endless stream of children. So the birth rate's gone down. Yeah, it's hardly surprising, and that is an effect that's an economic effect as much as a political one. Although certainly political effects have come to play, like the sort of idea that if you have children, you're succumbing to the patriarchy, and that's that sort of business. Men are bad, don't have anything to do with them. Children are the past world. Women now have careers. That's far more important. So there are those social and political factors, but the main thing behind the low birth rate is economic. Now, Jordan Peterson addressed this recently, and he said he got almost overwhelming hostility when he tried to address the birth rate, because immediately you start talking about this, people say, "Oh, what are you trying to do? You're trying to turn women into beasts of burden again, having 10 children, so that the patriarchy can be sure that they've got an heir and a spare, and allow for all the children who are going to die or be disabled by the time they grow up." Nobody's suggesting that. We should consider what's needed here is a small shift. Maybe one more child. Some people having one more child. You don't need big shifts to restore the replacement of the population to an adequate level, unless of course you have a deliberate policy of reducing the population. That's another route we could go down. But Jordan Peterson was actually, I think, quite shocked by the hostility to discussing this sort of things. He said 95% of the comments he got on his blogs were hostile to what he was saying. That when education improves, the birth rate goes down. What are you trying to do? Take women back to the past? No, you're not. So it appears that the birth rate is sort of sliding slightly outside the Overton window of respectable subject to discuss. And you notice people don't discuss it much. I mean, our whole community, our people in our past, our ancestors, and so on, and ourselves, if this goes on, we're going to come to an end. And yet it's hardly discussed at all, is it? Little bits in the paper, yeah, occasionally. Quite odd, very odd, when government, of course, and in the past has had plans for all kinds of things in long term, but we don't discuss our own disappearance. And that's the elephant in the room that we haven't really spotted, or not spotted too well. We'll shrink, if we carry on as we are, we'll shrink away to nothing. And that's not just happening to us, our community, of course it's happening all over the world. Japan, South Korea, same thing, falling birth rate. Women leave school and they want a career. Nothing wrong in that. And the career becomes, but the way it's put politically now, it's not a choice. It's the career is more important than having children, as a worthwhile lifestyle. Well, that's for everybody to decide, but as Peterson says, very few women are going to get to 50 or 60 without children and not ask themselves, have I made a bit of a mistake here, yeah? And think of those in my family if you feel that way. Of course, what they do is they say, well, if I had to have children, I wouldn't have been able to do something else, which is true, of course, there's choices. But we're not really discussing properly and openly what the choices are between child and career, and the fact that it has long-term consequences for our existence. Surely we should be at least discussing this adequately. Other reasons why we don't think in terms of having children? Well, the story is, oh, it's a bad world to bring children into. Well, it's always been a bad world to bring children into. In fact, it was a much worse world to bring children into 200 years ago. Much more dangerous and uncomfortable. So that's not really a very good argument. And also, of course, the more woke sort of people have started to think in terms of humans are enemies of the planet. Well, what does that mean? Enemy of the planet? I mean, is the planet a personality or something, you know? Enemies of the planet. I mean, as Peterson says, what the hell do you mean by that? Yeah? You know, enemies of the planet. It's a cult. It's actually a cult of self-hatred. Yeah? Wokery is a cult of self-hatred. Yeah, we humans are bad. It's really not a bad thing if we disappear off the face of the earth. But there's no real rational, ethical reason for that to happen unless you think the planet is a personality who can be personally harmed and upset by our existence. Now, if we don't correct all this, we're going to disappear. And at the moment, anyway, campaigning to try and correct it is not considered something of great interest to people. It's very, very peculiar because previous generations would have thought that not having children, replacing yourself and carrying on your line and not wanting to would be a very peculiar thing to do, you know, very peculiar way of thinking. I mean, anybody who thought like that in the world of Jane Austen, they'd be thought to, you know, really outside of society, you know, probably the wrong moral and ethical ideas. And that's where we are at the moment. So what can actually be done? Well, what might intervene to halt this process? Well, one thing is events. Macmillan's events, dear boy events, you know, you don't know what's going to happen. How many perceive that Putin would do what he's doing at the moment? Most of the commentators who even understand Putin didn't think he'd go this far. Anything can happen. I mean, the effect of the Putin war in Europe may make people start thinking in the sort of terms they used to think in, of defending your society, making sure it's replaced. A cultural shift may take place because of Putin and because of anything else that comes along. Steve Turley pays great attention to the fact that Conservatives tend to have more children than workers and left-wing people. So, and that's already noticeable in the demographics of the West. So, if the left don't have children, they'll die out.
Really?
Whereas the more conservative people, their children are likely to be more conservative, so they too will have more children, so it gets passed on. And also, of course, human aspiration. I mean, the fashion for childlessness, which is certainly very obvious at the moment. I mean, all too many women seem to think that spending 9 to 5 in an office and looking at a computer all day and going for coffee shops and occasional package holidays is a thoroughly worthwhile and free life. Seems to me to be a rather empty existence. But I think they've been persuaded that there's more in this, more in that sort of lifestyle than there really is, because of the prospect of some big career. Because the media is full of the idea that everybody can be a winner, isn't it? And everybody can be a huge player when they obviously can't. So I think possibly in time, people may come to see this fashion for childlessness as something rather bizarre that occurred in the late 20th century and the beginning of the next one. We shall see.